There are places where the earth itself seems to hold its breath, waiting for the rest of the world to remember what was lost. Just across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis, the flat floodplain stretches in an unbroken expanse of green and amber. To the casual eye, it is nothing but a quiet Midwestern landscape, a place of highways and rustling cornfields beneath a pale sky. But this ground is not flat, and it has never been silent if you know how to listen to the weight of its hidden architecture. They are the remnants of a sprawling, magnificent metropolis, a city that once pulsed louder than any other in what is now the United States, some 8 centuries ago. This is Cahokia, a name that hangs like smoke in the air, a civilization so vast and sophisticated that it defied every European assumption about the untamed New World. And its greatest enigma is not just how it rose with such breathtaking ambition on the riverbanks of the American bottom, but why it utterly collapsed and vanished from collective memory. Imagine walking through that same ground at the height of its power, around the year 1100, when the air was thick with the sound of 100,000 footsteps. In your mind, strip away the modern roads and the telephone poles. Let the distant growl of traffic dissolve into the rhythmic pounding of stone on wood, the crackle of ceremonial fires, and the chanting that rose like a tide toward the central pyramids. You are standing at the edge of a 50-acre grand plaza, a meticulously engineered expanse of packed clay, designed with a precise slope for drainage, an open-air theater for an entire civilization. A 2-mile-long wooden stockade, bristling with defensive bastions and requiring the felling of 20,000 trees, encloses the sacred heart of the city, a deliberate boundary separating the divine from the mundane. At the core of this fortress of faith and power stands its most defiant scar against the horizon, the stupendous Monks Mound, a terraced giant of earth rising 100 feet into the air. Its base alone is larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, an artificial mountain built not of stone, but of millions of packed earth baskets hauled by human hands in a staggering choreography of labor and belief. From the summit of this earthen colossus, the chief, or perhaps a sun priest, would have watched over a checkerboard of thatched neighborhoods, farmsteads, and distant marshlands, a kingdom of mud and wood that rivaled any throne in medieval Europe. The first whispers of this lost world reached modern ears not through grand expeditions, but through the mundane curiosity of settlers and farmers who called the mounds natural hills. They plowed around the larger swells, cursing the smaller ones as obstacles, never truly grasping that their wagon wheels were grinding over the pulverized bones of a vanished metropolis. It was only in the 20th century that the scale of the oversight became a deafening roar within the halls of archaeology. When aerial photography revealed the deliberate, celestial geometry hidden beneath the overgrowth, the evidence refused to stay buried. Excavation beneath the surface revealed a city planned with a level of astronomical precision that sent a shiver through the academic consensus. A circle of wooden posts, nicknamed Woodhenge, was unearthed, a massive solar calendar constructed of red cedar logs that tracked the equinoxes and solstices with an unerring, pragmatic science. Just outside the wooden henge, the soil holds a darker testament to the city's spiritual core, a sprawling burial mound known as Mound 72. It is here that the Cahokian narrative shifts from an architectural triumph to a deeply unsettling psychological labyrinth, one that challenges our modern moral compass. At the heart of this burial pit, a man, likely an elite falcon-warrior, was laid to rest on a platform of 20,000 shell beads meticulously stitched into the shape of a soaring bird, a cloak of shimmering white power. But he did not rest alone in that sacred darkness. Surrounding his central tomb were the skeletal remains of over 270 other individuals, placed with ritualistic precision. These were mass graves of mostly young women, their bones bearing signs of nutritional stress and violent trauma, a silent choir of retainer sacrifices interred to accompany the powerful soul into the next world. 4 men, their bodies mutilated by the removal of their heads and hands, lay nearby, a stark reminder that Cahokia's celestial beauty was built on a foundation of absolute and sometimes brutal hierarchical control. The artifacts that emerged from the clay, the fine, rammy-snouted pottery, and intricately carved shell gorgets displayed a unified artistic language that spread outward, a Mississippian culture radiating from this central hive. The city didn't just exist in isolation. It was the gravitational center of a vast trade network that pulled in copper from the Great Lakes, shark teeth from the Gulf Coast, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains, like a whirlpool draws in water. For 300 years, this powerhouse of humanity engineered the landscape, diverting creeks, building causeways, and creating a sprawling, fertile suburbia of maize farmers who fed the insatiable hunger of the urban machine. For as you run your fingers through the dark, rich soil of the American bottom, you are touching the residue of a profound evacuation, a sudden silence that fell over the Grand Plaza like a shroud of heavy fog. By the year 1350, the beating heart was faltering. By 1400, it had stopped entirely, leaving the pyramids to the mercy of the prairie grass and the creeping willow trees. Where archaeology falters in its attempt to pin down a single smoking gun, the imagination rushes in to fill the void, and the labyrinth of theories cuts deeper than any excavation trench. The first theory stems from the very resource that made the city possible, the wood that held up its temples and fed its eternal cooking fires, a resource that steadily retreated over the hills of the eastern horizon. Some researchers theorize that catastrophic deforestation rendered the landscape a vast, muddy scar, leading to ecological collapse as the rains washed the denuded soil into the creeks, choking the lifeblood of the subsistence system. Tree ring data, however, whispers a different, more celestial agony, pointing to the onset of a prolonged mega-drought that began to grip the region, turning the reliable corn harvests into brittle, withered stalks under a merciless sun. A darker hypothesis suggests that the very unifying power that built the Great Stockade became the source of its internal rot, that a single elite dynasty faced a violent, class-based rebellion from the exhausted margins of the city. Look at the defensive palisade itself, not just a spiritual barrier, but a barrier rebuilt 4 times in a single century, increasingly fortified with bastions, a terrified architecture bracing for an attack that clearly came from inside the known world. Perhaps it was not a single blow, but a cascading symphony of ruin, where a 2-year crop failure mutated into a spiritual crisis, shattering the populace's faith in the divine authority of the falcon-warrior chief atop the mound. In the fragile pre-modern theater of loyalty, a ruler who cannot deliver rain cannot command the will to plant, and a priest who loses his connection to the solstice loses the justification for sacrifice. The climate models tell us of the drought, and the pollen samples tell us of the dying forests, but the silent tension between these dry facts lies in the human reaction, the terror of a broken covenant with the gods. As the granaries emptied, did the crowds in the Grand Plaza turn their eyes not in reverence to the summit of Monks Mound, but in hunger and rage, their faith corroding into a dangerous, revolutionary silence. The fragmented records of the physical earth offer us no speeches, no final sermons, only the ghostly evidence of burned buildings and the sudden cessation of pottery styles that had defined an era. We are left staring at the dirt floor of a priest's collapsed house, trying to reconstruct the echo of a final scream of despair, or the defeated shuffle of a mass migration heading into the unknown. This is the point within the labyrinth where the hard evidence dissolves into the soft mist of conjecture. And the story of Cahokia transforms from an objective archaeological puzzle into a deeply human ghost story. The people did not vanish in a single flash of apocalyptic fire. Rather, they began a slow, painful diaspora, shedding the weight of urban complexity to survive the collapse of the system that had betrayed them. Small bands packed the sacred shell beads and the copper amulets, carrying the memory of the pyramids in their genetic code as they drifted south and west, fragmenting into the wind, becoming the ancestors of tribes like the Osage and the Quapaw. Yet, there is a chilling older layer to this mystery, a thin thread of narrative from the very first Europeans who ignored the ruins. When French missionaries and trappers ventured into the area in the 17th century, they stood in the shadow of the still giant pyramids, but the indigenous communities they met offered no clear living memory of the metropolis. The ancestors of the builders were surrounded by the physical ghosts of their grandfather's empire. Yet, a cultural amnesia had set in, a deliberate silence perhaps, or a traumatic forgetting that turned Monks Mound into a nameless hill. This is the most fragile artifact of all, not a carved tablet or a broken pot, but the absence of a story, the void where a founding myth should have been, consumed by the psychological necessity of moving on from a failed world. To stand before such silence is to confront the terrifying fragility of human legacy. An entire civilization, the largest of its age, simply fell out of the narrative memory of its own descendants in a matter of generations. And where the native memory faded, the European imagination proved just as blind, constructing a myth of a vast, sparsely inhabited continent, an empty wilderness that was waiting to be truly discovered and filled. Ironically, the mound-building past was so inconvenient to the narrative of the empty frontier that for a century a bizarre counter-theory infected American intellectual life, the myth of a lost race of mound builders. Theorists refused to believe the ancestors of the native peoples were capable of such monolithic engineering, inventing phantom civilizations of stranded Vikings, lost tribes of Israel, or drowned Atlanteans to explain away the sheer audacity of the earthworks. It was a form of intellectual erasure twice over. First, the city buried itself in mud, and then the hubris of the colonial mind buried its legacy under a mountain of racist mythology, refusing to recognize the genius of the American original. The true human obsession with Cahokia, therefore, is not just about unlocking a medieval puzzle, but about correcting a long, dark shadow of blindness, to finally restore the dignity of a forgotten empire to the historical record. Archaeologists who have devoted their lives to these digs speak not just of dirt strata, but of a profound intimacy with the past, a feeling of walking through a sleeping city that breathes beneath their feet. They feel the weight of the past in the way the sun hits the plaster of a 5-centimeter thick floor, crafted with a precision that modern concrete would envy. A silent testament to a craftsman's pride in a world without metal tools. They find the fingerprints of a child pressed into a mud brick wall that was drying in the sun 800 years ago. A frozen gesture that connects your own humanity to a sudden, piercing moment of the ordinary in the shadow of the pyramid. It is this human scale that makes the final abandonment so harrowing to ponder. We are not just looking at the death of a political system, but at the shattering of a home, the dissolution of families, and the end of a child's specific view of the sky. As you stand on the Grand Plaza at twilight, the shadows of the modern jets pass silently over the silent furrows of the ancient causeways, a fleeting intersection of two different worlds of ambition. We watch our own cities consume their hinterlands. We track our own changing climate with a nervous, superstitious eye, and we wonder if we are looking into a mirror that has already shown us the end of the story. The sand in the hourglass of Cahokia ran out not with a dramatic explosion, but with a quiet, exhausted sigh of grass growing over the central plazas and reeds choking the once manicured waterways. The city did not die in a day. It withered over a century of crisis, a slow-motion cascade failure where the political center could no longer hold, and the periphery simply peeled away to find a new future in the wilderness. Eventually, the great stockade itself, the ultimate symbol of the city's anxious power, collapsed inward, its rotting red cedar logs crashing into the mud, burying the boundaries between the serene and the terrified. By the time the last embers of a cooking fire flickered out in a deserted, wind-swept hut, the landscape had already begun its patient reclamation, swallowing the grid of the streets and returning the geometry of humanity to a seemingly natural disorder. To be obsessed with Cahokia is to fall in love with the unfinished symphony, to stare at an artifact that we have pieced back together from shards, only to realize that the music it played is permanently lost. An archaeologist once held a broken, incised whelk shell from the Gulf of Mexico found in the debris of a Cahokian trash pit and noted the sheer distance it traveled, a piece of the ocean resting in the mud of the heartland. That shell, carved with the symbols of the Falcon Man, is a story of a journey, but it offers no voice for the reasons it was thrown away or the nature of the final days of the household that discarded it in the garbage. Even the name Cahokia is a borrowed ghost, a label taken from a subgroup of the Illinois Confederation who lived nearby in the 1600s, a name applied to a place whose true original designation vanished on the wind like smoke from a collapsed temple. We use this borrowed name to anchor our conversation, but in doing so, we acknowledge the chasm of the unknown, a universe of songs, dreams, and political intrigues that will never be chronicled in anything but the silent, dark void of a forgotten library. The human mind, desperate for closure, wants a single culprit, a villain to hang the tragedy upon, but the earth refuses to simplicate its own history, insisting on a tangled web of soil exhaustion, shifting faith, and social pressure. It is the unanswerable question that lingers like a low-lying mist over the American bottom. What if the abandonment was not a failure, but a choice, a conscious, collective decision to walk away from the trappings of a complex, doomed civilization? Perhaps the survivors of Cahokia looked at the muddy, struggling Metropolis and made a philosophical decision to reject the heaviness of the pyramid, to choose the freedom of the small village, the network over the hierarchy, the humility of the forest over the ego of the monument. This theory flips the narrative of collapse on its head, suggesting not a defeat, but a liberation, a silent revolution won not by burning the palace, but simply by quietly walking out of the city's shadow, one family at a time. It is a haunting, beautiful, and deeply unsettling idea that the greatest mark of success for a human soul is not to build a tower that touches the sky, but to have the wisdom to recognize when a monument has become a tomb and to walk away. Yet, the clockwork of time and sand continues its relentless march, and the very mounds that hold these secrets are still under a subtle, modern siege, not from conquering warriors, but from the indifferent pressure of suburban sprawl and the rumble of highway construction. Just as the ancient stockade succumbed to the forces of wood rot, the modern ruins of the drive-in theater and the truck stop encroach on the edges of this sacred UNESCO World Heritage Site, a slow collision between the disposable present and the monumental past. The fight to preserve Cahokia is itself a reflection of the human obsession, a mirror of the ancient labor that built the mounds, channeled now into the desperate effort to maintain the silence of the ground against the roar of the machine. As the sun sinks below the western bluffs across the Mississippi, the cicadas begin their nightly hymn, a drone that sounds like the breathing of the earth itself, exhaling the day's heat over the silent, humped forms of the pyramids. From the summit of Monks Mound in the gathering dusk, the lights of St. Louis ignite on the opposite bank, a glittering carpet of electric fire that traces the same ancient trade routes once lit by torchlight. You look down from this ancient height and realize you are standing at the center of an immense millennial conversation between two distinct epochs of urban humanity, separated by a chasm of silence and a few inches of grass. This lost city reminds us that a metropolis is not a permanent state of being, but a fragile, energy-intensive flame that must be perpetually fed with fuel, with faith, and with the loyalty of millions of beating human hearts. The story of this place is the story of a star that burned too bright in the medieval skies, a supernova of human organization that collapsed back into the dark matter of the forest from which it had, with such colossal effort, carved itself. The deep, philosophic terror of the abyss stares back at us from the empty plaza, the realization that history is not a steady accumulation, but a series of fragile, brilliant experiments, most of which end in a quiet, undiscovered ruin. We dig for answers, yet the soil gives us back only more questions, wrapped in the beautiful broken shell of a distant ocean, or the echo of a bonfire that has been cold for 800 winters. The enduring enigma of Cahokia is not that a city failed, but that it succeeded for so long against such overwhelming odds of wood, mud, and a relentless, capricious climate, only to be erased so completely from the memory of the land. It stands as a meditation on hubris and humility, a broken clock by which we can measure the pulse of our own civilization. A civilization that also squares its shoulders against the rising river and the changing sky. The final, lingering image is not of the grandeur of the falcon-warrior, but of the last anonymous woman who walked out of the eastern gate, turning for a final look at the rotting stockade before melting into the forest, carrying a piece of the city in her mind. We are the inheritors, not of their specific gods or kings, but of their profound human dilemma, the eternal, unresolved tension between the comfort of the organized metropolis and the terrifying freedom of the wild. As the fog settles into the swales and the shadows merge into a single uniform blanket of night, the mounds finally regain their anonymity, looking once again like the natural, silent hills that the first settlers mistook them for 2 centuries ago. The silence out here, when the distant highway lulls, is a thick, living thing, a heavy cloak woven from the memories of a nation whose name is lost, whose songs are evaporated, but whose presence is as real as the ground beneath your feet. Perhaps that is the most profound truth of Cahokia. The city was never truly lost. It simply returned to a language we, in our modern haste, have forgotten how to read, waiting patiently for the earth to translate its long, dark, and magnificent secret.